I lived in Korea for 2.5 years or thereabouts. I was teaching English. I went to school to learn Korean because I certainly didn't speak it at home growing up. And I was thinking about going to grad school near the end of that period, and reached out to my old boss at the Wall Street Journal, and he sort of asked me what did I want to do with my life, and I said, well, I'd love to be a foreign correspondent in Korea at some point. And he said, well, do you want to come at this from an academic point of view, or if you actually want to learn what's going on there, you should just do journalism. So I lucked out. They still offered me a job after that interlude in Korea, and that's when I went to Chicago. So I've popped around to different cities and different beats. And once I was at the Journal, we don't actually have that many Korean speakers among our U.S. staff. So I think they always had targeted me and thought of me for opportunities in Seoul. And the one I went for was in 2017. So I came out here to cover Samsung right as the Galaxy Note 7 phones had blown up, and the leader of the company got thrown in jail. And spent a couple years doing that, and then last year I was promoted to Korea Bureau Chief.
Good evening and welcome to our Young Professionals Night webcast. I'm Tom Byrne, President of the Korea Society. We are excited to present this webcast in partnership with the New York chapter of the Asian American Journalists Association, AAJA, New York chapter. The New York chapter is the largest chapter of the Asian American Journalists Association, with more than 770 members in the New York area. Its mission is to advance the representation of Asian American and Pacific Islanders in newsrooms, as well as to promote fair and accurate coverage of AAPI issues. Our guest tonight is Timothy Martin, Korea Bureau Chief for the Wall Street Journal. As Bureau Chief, Timothy oversees coverage of a wide range of issues and all the hot issues on the Korean Peninsula, including North Korea, Kim Jong-un, Samsung, and everything else that's happening. He has worked at the Journal for more than a decade in its Chicago, Atlanta, New York offices before being promoted and posted to Seoul in 2017. Timothy has covered a wide range of stories, including the U.S. painkiller epidemic. He's covered Wall Street, global business, and many other stories. Moderating tonight's webcast is Frank B., President of Asian American Journalists Association's New York chapter. Frank is also a senior storytelling engineer at Vox Media in New York City, where he works on innovative storytelling projects for the web. Frank also teaches data literacy and visualization at Fordham University and is a Google News Initiative trainer, teaching journalists at newsrooms and conferences across the country on how to utilize free journalism tools. I hope you enjoy tonight's program. Before turning it over to Timothy and Frank, I would like to thank our IT director, Peter, who has been working tirelessly all day long. We've had several programs today to ensure that all of our Korea Society webcasts run smoothly and professionally as this one. I'd also like to thank Esther, who is our YPN director. She's done a wonderful job at promoting this initiative, Young Professional Networks Initiative at the Korea Society. So Frank and Tim, the screen is yours.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Thomas. Timothy, really nice to meet you. What time is it in Korea right now? I'm just curious. We're doing a webcast, but nevertheless wanted to see because you're in the office and you're adjusting your shades a little bit ago.
Yeah, ditto. It's 9:09 a.m. here, so it's we're a bit in the future compared to you guys in New York.
Yeah. And how are you guys doing in Korea? Just wanted to ask about that to start.
Yeah, we've relaxed social distancing for over a month, though we've had these clusters of cases popping up that's caused the country to, sort of stay on edge. But I mean, you look outside, other than the fact that you see face masks on most people, things have really, in a way, gone back to some form of normalcy. You pop down to a restaurant at lunch, it's crowded. People are certainly out at night. so yeah, it's not quite the darkest days here, but you know, people are still very cognizant of the virus. I mean, it's, you know, as as you're sort of like crowded and hunched to each other, you know, at a restaurant or a bar, you're all saying, well, geez, this isn't very social distancing friendly, is it? So there is this sort of, you know, self-awareness about it.
Yeah. Popping into a restaurant, what a novel idea. I'm in New York City and couldn't even dream of it right now. We'll see how long it is before we can actually do that here in New York City. But before we kind of dive a little bit more deeper into kind of your team's coronavirus coverage, I want to kind of touch on your very impressive resume that Thomas kind of alluded to a little bit ago. He said that you've been working at the Wall Street Journal for over 10 years. I looked at LinkedIn. You're about to hit 12 years. Is that right?
Yes, yes. And I was an intern twice at the Wall Street Journal, but the first time in 2005. So some of my fellow interns from that year are at the company and in AAJA. So we were marveling at the fact that that was 15 years ago.
I'd love to dive a little bit into your background. I think being the Korea bureau chief, it's a dream job for a lot of journalists at AAJA, right? To cover the country where their parents were born, right? And have a lot of vast interest in it. Can you kind of share with us your journey before Wall Street Journal and starting and then kind of leading us to where you are now?
Sure. So my name is Timothy Martin, which might not be totally sync with my face. So I was born in Korea, in Gwangju, in the southwest corner, and at a very young age, about 3 months, I was adopted to American parents just outside Chicago. So I spent most of my upbringing and life in remote central Illinois, and I knew I wanted to be a journalist from a young age. I mean, my earliest memories were cheering on the Chicago Bulls during their, you know, 6 championships in 8 years as it came out in The Last Dance. So it might be a surprise to you that I realized I would not make it to the NBA as an athlete. And I thought, well, the next best thing, I had a passion for writing. The next best thing might be to hang out in the locker rooms and cover them as a journalist. So I knew from basically high school that this was something I wanted to do, and you know, started working for my college paper, got some internships, and that eventually led me to a Wall Street Journal internship, which I had originally gotten the connection through AAJA. I had applied for an AAJA internship my freshman year, and one of the judges, or one of the people vetting the candidates, was a WSJ reporter in Chicago at the time, Shirley Lung, who's now, I think, in Boston. And you know, I went to AAJA, the national convention, that summer, and to my surprise, the WSJ people already knew who I was when I stopped. You know, basically from an class, you know, student, I was sort of angling to try and get to the WSJ as an intern. So, you know, I spent a lot of time at my college paper, eventually worked for the local professional paper my junior and senior year. And then, yeah, after those 2 years of school, I interned at the WSJ. So I had, you know, slaved away. Basically, I was working 6 days a week in college, all journalism related. And after my second internship, the WSJ offered me a job. But coinciding with all of this, I had started to grasp with my sort of Korean side, which, you know, for the first 20 years of my life, I hadn't really explored. You know, where I grew up in Illinois, there were really no other Koreans other than my sister, who's also adopted. And it was just a part of me that I didn't really explore. So in college, I had met some Koreans, and I had some coworkers at summer internships who were Korean American. And that got me interested learning about where I was from. So I took a trip right after my college graduation, but before my senior year internship at the Journal, to Korea. I actually came and stayed with a whole bunch of friends, went around Korea and just loved it. And I thought, you know, I should really explore my roots. And I thought, if I don't do it now, who knows where my life could go. I could end up meeting and possibly marrying an American, and, you know, I might never get the opportunity to live in Korea. So I actually turned down the job offer. I lived in Korea for 2.5 years or thereabouts. I was teaching English. I went to school to learn Korean because I certainly didn't speak it at home growing up. And I was thinking about going to grad school near the end of that period, and reached out to my old boss at the Wall Street Journal, and he sort of asked me what did I want to do with my life, and I said, well, I'd love to be a foreign correspondent in Korea at some point. And he said, well, do you want to come at this from an academic point of view, or if you actually want to learn what's going on there, you should just do journalism. So I lucked out. They still offered me a job after that interlude in Korea, and that's when I went to Chicago. So I've popped around to different cities and different beats. And once I was at the Journal, we don't actually have that many Korean speakers among our U.S. staff. So I think they always had targeted me and thought of me for opportunities in Seoul. And the one I went for was in 2017. So I came out here to cover Samsung right as the Galaxy Note 7 phones had blown up, and the leader of the company got thrown in jail. And spent a couple years doing that, and then last year I was promoted to a Korea bureau chief.
Wow, that's quite the journey. And actually, when you mentioned that, we actually had similar dreams growing up. I wanted to be in the NBA too, but look at both of us now, right? So can you share with some of our viewers, how long did it take for you to have that the goal of becoming the bureau chief instilled in you into achieving it last year? What was that kind of process like?
Yeah, I mean, I was pretty deliberate about what career choices I made. Obviously I got lucky in that I was a WSJ intern and then started my career there. But, basically all my career choices, I had at one point like 10 different jobs in my first 10 years. And all of my career choices were aimed toward building the tool set or toolkit to eventually become bureau chief. So I covered a bunch of companies in the U.S., general and political news in the Midwest and the South. And I actually intentionally went to New York to learn finance. So I was writing about pension funds and the bond market. And by time I was, tapped to come out to Korea to cover Samsung and tech, I'd sort of thought that my next position could be the bureau chief. So once, my boss, he moved on to Beijing to become the editor there. Looking back, I had basically experience in all the major sections of the paper. Had covered Samsung, which is, to understand Korea, you really have to understand Samsung. And just being here, North Korea comes up. Even as I was covering Samsung, I had sort of a niche beat writing about North Korean hacking. So that got me some exposure to the Kim regime. But yeah, I think I made a lot of choices early on in my career to diversify the coverage areas, and obviously tried to move up into more prominent positions so that if the Korea bureau chief opening came around, that I'd be a strong candidate for it.
Seems like this is kind of like your last dance, not quite last dance, but this is your ultimate goal and you're there, and that's really awesome, right? And for a lot of the students that go through, AAJA, and you were one of them too, they focus a lot on, the school, how to write, a lead, a nut graph, all these different things that are in textbooks. But I want to ask you kind of what's kind of one thing that you found that was super helpful? What's one of those intangible things that you would give advice to a student now to become a bureau chief? What is one thing that you tell them to start focusing on that's not in the textbooks that they read?
Oh, totally. I think, I actually think two things sort of jump out. Just on the production end, I come from a reporting background, so I'm not, someone who does a lot of video or editing traditionally. But I think, just on the reporting end, just throw yourself out there, especially now. There are fewer and fewer sort of local reporting jobs that exist. So the traditional way someone might come through in a career, they'd start at a small paper. So, or a metro paper, and there you're really just hitting the streets, and you have to interact with all the people you're covering. So you get this sort of inherent level of responsibility and accountability that you're not dealing with just armies of PR people, and you're always one step removed from what you're writing about. So I think just getting to the point that you're comfortable with hearing no a lot, which is one of the realities of journalism that most people you ask to talk won't. Most sort of obvious paths for stories, there's some resistance. So I think just going out there and trying many different types of jobs, I think is an essential point. I'd also say, I mean, look, I think there's a tinge of hypocrisy in this in this tip, but because I started at the Wall Street Journal, but I think, I wouldn't obsess over, how prestigious the media company is. I think you just do any job that you can grow your skills. Even within the WSJ structure, I took a lot of jobs over the years that on paper were less prominent than my other options, but I just did them to expose myself to new and different topics. I mean, I think even among the WSJ ranks, I took sort of an unusual trajectory, having literally 10 different jobs my first 10 years. So, some of those I did really well in, some, I didn't do that well in, but I got to try on, different roles, different tasks. And, I mean, sitting here in Korea, my time in Atlanta when I covered public health in the painkiller epidemic, it came in really handy once coronavirus dropped, which I don't know if, if you would have asked me before I came out here in 2017, would I be using much of that? I probably would have said no, but lo and behold, it was an incredibly valuable skill to have. So I think diversifying your experiences, especially when you're young, you should move around, maybe even move to different companies. And then also on the sort of job choice and just doing the job, I mean, be ambitious and, don't be afraid if, you get a lot of no's.
Yeah, you really have to be a kind of a curious soul in our industry, don't you? So, um, to an outsider, and before I dive into to coronavirus a little bit, but to an outsider, media journalism might seem like a very cutthroat industry. At AAJA, we really try to show that it's not quite cutthroat as it may appear, and there's a lot of mentoring that happens, right? I wanted to get your take on mentoring, but also wanted to give you a chance to talk about someone that really helped you along the way.
Yeah, I mean, there were like traditional mentors. I mean, we sort of fall in touch, but like, Shirley, during my first years in journalism school was just completely instrumental. I mean, even if she probably only did 3 or 4 things, she made that critical first introduction to the WSJ news recruiter. I mean, my career would have looked completely differently if I didn't apply for that scholarship or internship, and I didn't make it to the finalist, round. There are so many mentors that came up through AAJA. I actually, like you, I spent a summer on the Voices staff. It was at Unity in 2004, and I got to rub shoulders with Eric Johnson. I think was at the Arizona Republic at the time, and just that whole AAJA community was really helpful. Just showing as a college student, sort of people at different levels of their career, to show that there's a pathway up. I think once I actually started, at the Journal, the idea of mentorship doesn't quite come through as it might seem in like movies or what the traditional expectations of mentorship are. A lot of the it's not the senior editor that pops out of their office and puts their arm around your shoulder and says, here's the way I do things. I mean, a lot of the best mentorship I got were from reporters who are fellow reporters who are maybe just 5 or 10 years more experienced than me, and possibly had the time and the energy, right, to indulge a young reporter asking so many questions. I mean, one of the reporters I started off with in Chicago, he's still at the company. His name's Doug Belkin, and he had the unfortunate circumstance of sitting right next to the water cooler. So I was, fresh out of school and hadn't even been doing journalism for the past couple of years because I was in Korea, and I would just constantly harass him with questions about, how to work through stories. And, he was, in those early days, hugely instrumental. I think if you do end up working for a company that has a lot of talent in the editing ranks, not all companies are like that, but if you do have that opportunity, I mean, certainly your bosses have tremendous influence over you. I mean, my first boss in Chicago, Brian Grewley, just sort of showed like how cool journalism could be to me. My second boss in Atlanta, Betsy McKay, she just sort of showed me how to go from being like a candidate, like a prospect, a youth prospect, to really showing me the ropes about how to be a proper WSJ reporter. And I picked up so many others from other bosses over the years.
That's really great, Timothy. I want to dive in a little more about your work in towards coronavirus coverage, right? So as the Korea bureau chief, how do you assign reporters to cover the virus? How do you and your colleagues go about finding relevant sources?
Yeah, I think it's not as complicated as you might think. So the cases really started skyrocketing in mid-February, and I still remember the day that we sort of kicked off coverage. I mean, there were a few days where cases started to increase. There's maybe a couple dozen, and it was a Friday. I remember I actually went to lunch because there were no social distancing. Coronavirus wasn't really seen as a huge threat at the time. I went to lunch, and we were just sort of talking like, oh, the cases are going up, and I left for the lunch thinking like we wouldn't be covering it anytime soon, and I came back, and then the health officials had updated. It was now hundreds of cases, and I realized that we would have to kick into gear. So that I realized just in that space of a couple hours that this was something very substantial. To answer your question, it wasn't that complicated the first week because I'm one of 5 people on the bureau. That first week it really erupted. One person was on vacation. Our Samsung reporter is still in the U.S. waiting for her visa, and we had another reporter who had been out taking some personal time. So it was just the 2 of us. So it was myself and my colleague Dassel Yoon, and we sort of were talking about, should we both go down to this hard hit city, Daegu, which is about 2-3 hours away from Seoul. And, we were doing the calculation of, should we both go? And we decided that we would send her. So she stayed down there for a month, and, did a lot of fantastic on the ground reporting. In the early stages of the coronavirus outbreak, the stories were a bit straightforward and obvious, right? It was just sort of a country grappling with this fairly early on without much precedent. So we were just following the developments at the beginning. As the story started to change and more countries began to be affected by this, then we had to make some more sort of smart decisions about how we came at this in a way that was unique and instructive to other places, rather than just sort of doing a story that probably was the case in many other places.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of those stories too, where, as journalists, we report it, but we're also watching out for it at the same time, right? So it's very tricky in that way too. I know that you did some of your reporting, or you and your team did some reporting, and at some point in February, it was kind of, there was kind of reports saying there might not be enough doctors, right? So just for us to understand in America, what is it like to kind of witness this kind of start bubbling up? What was the reaction of the people that you were reporting for?
Yeah, it was, I mean, at this point you have to, for most of February and the first days of March, I mean, no country outside of China had an explosion of cases like South Korea. So there wasn't really an analog that we could point to and say, well, Italy handled it this way, Israel handled it that way. I mean, this was sort of an unprecedented shock to the system. So, there were doctor shortages. I mean, I think now, months later, I think most people around the world would praise South Korea for its response. But you're right. I mean, the first couple of days and the first week, it was just the number of cases were multiplying so quickly. the system couldn't really keep up. So yeah, there were doctor shortages, staff locally, they were like nurses, they were quitting because their families were terrified of the risk. There weren't enough supplies. So yeah, I mean, initially it was, there was a lot of disarray.
Yeah, and you reported, I think on March 16th, that roughly 1 out of every 200 residents had been examined at that point. How was Korea able to just quickly start testing? How are they able to achieve kind of this in a relatively short time?
Yeah, so, once we got past the first week or so, that's when a sort of prearranged response kicked into place. So the important thing to remember about South Korea and coronavirus is that this isn't their first recent bout with an infectious disease outbreak. 5 years ago, there was the Middle East respiratory system outbreak that was, deadly and really exposed all of the shortcomings of the government response and sort of how citizens should react in that moment. So this was widely seen as a failure by the government, and it triggered the creation of this system that now we can see with coronavirus. So there are multiple elements to this. One is widespread testing to test aggressively. So that wasn't just political will. It was the regulators early on knew they had to fast track the approval of these tests. The manufacturers, had to be ready and proactively seeking the opportunity. And even just having the tests, you need the laboratories, right, to quickly determine if someone has coronavirus or not. I mean, the MERS outbreak 5 years ago, there were only like 5 or 6 places in the country that if you got a test, you could send for diagnostics. They've dramatically scaled it up. It's like 100 now. And again, Korea is the geographic size of Indiana. It's about 52 million people. So, they had all that smoothed out by the time the coronavirus had started to escalate here. And even before cases erupted in mid-February, the country had already approved tests. So once the problem was here, they could go and engage the system very quickly. That's just one facet, though. I mean, there was also contact tracing, which I think has gotten attention globally. The magnitude and the failure of the MERS outbreak really provided both political will, but also among the citizens an understanding that to really corral this disease, health investigators needed access to a whole range of information. This is stuff that in the West would largely be, they would not be tolerated or it would be illegal. So they have access to things like your credit card statements, all the mobile data on your smartphone, CCTV. And they have this level of omniscience that is sort of unrivaled among democracies around the world. And the third sort of element here, the third major element that kicked into place, again, from the lessons 5 years ago, were things that weren't written into law, but it was societal. It was the citizens knew the drill. So Korea never had a mandatory lockdown. The government recommended people stay indoors, wear face masks, limit their gatherings with, large groups. And, there were some dissidents, but largely people sort of followed the drill. And I think you take those 3 factors, I think what distinguished South Korea versus other places, they had drilled and, thought about what a response might look like. And it wasn't something that they were crafting on the fly, which is what we're seeing in a lot of other places. But again, that starts with a very painful incident.
Yeah.
5 years ago.
From experience. Yeah, they learned a lot from experience. I wanted to actually dive in a little bit into that privacy part you talked about a little earlier. Obviously, Korea probably has a lot more CCTV. They have a lot more access to data from just individuals. How do the Korean citizens take that? How do they handle that? How do they respond to that? And then also having lived in America before, spent your entire childhood there in your school, do you think the United States would be able to handle something like that?
The unfettered access to your smartphone data, no, I don't think this would be something popular in the US at all. I mean, you've already seen a lot of consternation about this collaboration that Apple and Google have around using some sort of distant anonymous data from people's smartphones. I mean, basically, Korea, they can crack open the brains of your smartphone and see everything. I do not think this would be tolerated in the U.S. And you even see backlash to like lockdowns, right? That Americans feel like the government can't tell them to stay indoors or not get a haircut. I think because sort of what runs within South Korea, they have. I mean, there's always this sort of glance at sort of how the world views South Korea, and I think because the international praise has been quite uniform for the response, I think people have sort of accepted that this is part of the narrative for the coronavirus. And you do see backlash from certain human rights groups, individual privacy organizations, but they're sort of a minority at this point. Most people are okay with giving up this amount of privacy because they can directly point to success in the response. And I think once this dissipates, I think there will and should be some tough questions asked about how much civil liberties have been given up, and if this was perhaps too strong of a response or tactics given the circumstances. Now, in some cases, the health officials have sort of they have sort of relaxed or they've not only do they have access to all this information, they're making it public on the health websites, health ministry websites, and local sort of district websites as well, to inform people of where the infections are traveling and who might be affected. And it lists your age, your workplace, where you've been. This is all it's like a digital diary of these people's lives. They've tinkered with it some. So like they used to actually list what apartment complex you were in, which basically is, enough to isolate you individually. They've stopped some of that information sharing publicly. But obviously, it's still quite easy to figure out who might, who it might be if you're a sleuth.
Yeah. I want to go ask another question about kind of being bureau chief during the coronavirus pandemic. How do you prepare your team to do this type of reporting when you sense one of your reporters a Daegu? What do you tell him or her? How do you prepare your team to do this kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, we're one of the larger newspaper staffs, at least among Western outlets. So we have 5 people, though 2 of them were not in the country or available. I think because we have a relatively small staff, most of the reporters are very flexible in terms of the topics they cover. I mean, in practical terms, the coronavirus coverage was, just a lot of on the ground reporting, going to hospitals, talking to local officials, going to restaurants and asking like how much business had fallen off. So it was mostly just picking the idea and then sort of asking them to go out in the streets to do the assignments. I will say, it turned into an interesting logistical challenge. I mean, we obviously had China blow up before Korea, and so we have this sort of global security team that procured all of this. I mean, it looks like Breaking Bad if you're fully suited up. I mean, if you walk into a hospital, you have like the full gown, you have shoe covers, you have face masks. I mean, I've been sent like 500 face masks, because if you're out in reporting the field, you got to use 2 or 3 a day, hand sanitizer, et cetera. So that part was nice to know. At least we had the equipment. I mean, for the reporter, and we actually sent a freelance photographer there as well. I mean, we had to gear up tremendously for them to keep them safe. We got them like a heart rate monitor, like a Fitbit basically. We got them a manual blood pressure check, right? Just to sort of monitor the symptoms. And like they had to update twice a day, how their health was. So yeah, in terms of reporting the story and assigning them, it was, this sort of balance of, risk versus reward. We ended up not doing a lot of reporting inside the hospitals, partly because we didn't get access, but it's it was definitely crazy. I mean, the first month, 4 to 6 weeks, I remember I got like a blister on my thumb from like typing too much and hitting the space bar. And, it was literally, I mean, the moment I woke up till, 11 midnight, I mean, it was, and oftentimes after that, it was just an exhaustive process. And again, I do editing, I'm bureau chief, but I still do a lot of writing. So I was heavily involved in this throughout.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your work. The next question I want to ask is probably something that very relevant to our American viewers, right? So I know South Korea just had its National Assembly election in April this year, right? In spite of the pandemic, the country witnessed its highest voter turnout since 1992, and I have in my notes 66% of eligible voters participating in America. That's unheard of, right? So even more remarkable than that, no cases emerged from the elections, no cases of of coronavirus. So what can America learn from this, or other countries?
Yeah, well, one, that it's possible. I think, I think the one thing you feel when you're living in South Korea and you're trading notes with people who live in Europe or the US, I mean, that system we were talking about before, put in place after MERS, I mean, it does provide quite a high safety net. I mean, the death rate is quite low in Korea relative to other places. And that's because, if you catch coronavirus, you can get tested very quickly and hear the results very quickly, and that there's going to be a hospital bed. So I think with that as, again, the safety net, they felt confident in mid-April to, hold these elections, and most people voted in person. Now, at the voting precincts that day, yeah, it looked a lot different. Everyone needed to have hand sanitizer. There was social distancing. Everyone had to stand 1 meter, or about 3 feet apart. You had your temperature checked. I mean, there was sort of like a assembly line like nature to it. I think for the U.S., their calculation will have to be, how prevalent or how available are the tests? What does the health care system situation look like with hospital beds? I mean, if the potential risk is that these voting precincts become a hotbed for infections, can the rest of the system, handle it, or will it be overwhelmed? But again, I think South Korea at least shows it's possible. It even altered the campaigning. I'm remembering we did a story where we were, social distancing was still in effect. So we followed a candidate. She was snaking through the alleyways of Seoul neighborhood, and people were told to stay indoors. So it's not like there were a lot of people roaming in the streets. So she sort of had to shout to the skies. And I think she even said at one point, like, I can't see your faces, but I hope you can hear this message. So it was very interesting, because campaigning, is often, these like huge events and huge gatherings, but this was, it looked a lot different this time around.
No, that's very interesting. I got to ask, so in America, it's 6 feet apart for social distancing. Obviously, they don't use the system in Korea. What is it in Korea? Is it 2 meters?
Yeah, I do think the health officials do say 2 meters, 6 feet, but I think for whatever reason at the voting precincts, maybe because the lines would become too untenable, they shortened it to 3 feet.
3 feet. Okay. So the response in Korea hasn't been perfect, right? There's been a few outbreaks, I think 2 that I have in my notes. What are kind of the difficulties of reopening and returning to normalcy?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're in one of these countries like the U.S., where you've just been domesticated and forced to stay indoors for months, right? And now that things are reopening, I think there's this sort of hope that, we've not only flattened the curve, but that the risk is gone. I mean, look, until we get a vaccine, the coronavirus is going to be circulating. I think countries and cities are going to have a higher level of defense going forward, but it's not gone. And I think South Korea has sort of shown this. I mean, we reopened in early May, and yeah, I mean, literally the day social distancing measures were relaxed, that's when this nightclub case, that the person was confirmed. And it's had an interesting effect just living here, over the past month. I mean, most of the new cases are in the Seoul metropolitan area. So that basically any night out, any time you step outdoors, really, that you're running the risk with it. But because the case counts have been relatively low, you can get tested, and the death rate does not seem particularly high. You do get desensitized to it as a person living here. I think undoubtedly this is what we're going to see, in Europe and the U.S. as they reopen. The virus is still going to be there, and people are going to have to answer for themselves. What's the level of risk they're willing to take on?
So I see that you're in the office today. Many of us in the U.S. aren't back in their offices, especially in New York, right? I'm not allowed back in my office for the foreseeable future. Tell us what it's like in Korea right now. You obviously can go outside. What is it like outside? Are people wearing masks, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, so I actually came to the office throughout. I mean, I never actually worked from home. I'm married. My wife, her company has told her to work remotely, so she took the home office, if you will. So my options were like the living room couch or the dining room table. And our policy here, we have all of our reporters working remotely, but the office was empty. So we're in a WeWork actually, and it really thinned out in February, March, and April. I think people are starting to come back now. Outdoors, yeah. I mean, look, other than the face mask, if you were to like snap your fingers Avengers style and all the face masks disappeared, it wouldn't look too dissimilar to a year ago. Because of these new clusters, there are certain things that are closed, like museums, parks, churches. They're still asked to do things remotely. There are different sort of facets of life that have also changed. Starting this week, to go to like a club. I mean, you can definitely go to a club or a bar where there's dancing, but you have to like leave QR code information. If you go to your gym, you have to, leave enough information that if there were an outbreak, you could be contacted very quickly. So, it has the premise of looking somewhat normalized, but there are these sort of like social distancing measures still around.
What do you think that's going to look like, say, a month from now?
I think eventually, the museums and the parks will reopen. I really don't think, like the sports stadiums, the large political gatherings or protests. I don't know if those will be available, in a month. I think this sort of, measured reopening. I think it's going to be with us until there's a vaccine. I mean, Korea again is quite vigilant on this stuff, but still we're seeing dozens of new cases every day. And again, this might seem quite small compared to other countries. I think U.S. is still over 10,000 new cases a day. It's obviously a much larger country, but I think the fact that it's still there, I think absent like 2-3 weeks of zero cases, I think we're going to have some sacrifice at the local level until the vaccine comes.
Yeah, until the vaccine comes. I imagine for your team, kind of just to put things all in perspective, imagine at some point your team was probably 100% or very close to it focused on reporting on coronavirus. What is it now, and how do you see kind of the next few months pan out for your team?
Yeah, I think we call it internally counter programming, right? So stuff that's not related to coronavirus. I mean, now we have the protests in the U.S. that's sort of stolen some of the attention away from the coronavirus. Yeah, I think look, it was really funny. I mean, just as things had started to sort of slow here, then we had the whole escapade with Kim Jong-un rumored to be dead. So
Yeah.
we had North Korea injected back into our lives. No, I think moving forward, I do think globally it's starting to look a bit like South Korea, where, you see reopening. The second wave of infections aren't as dramatic as the first wave, again, because there are some speed bumps or impediments, or people are altering their behavior. They know at least on some level, the threat. So yeah, I think, we're, at one point we were all focused on coronavirus. I think, we'll sort of revert to the mean, in a way. We have most of our reporting focus on North Korea, Samsung, and sort of general politics. So I think we'll sort of go back to our old beats in a way in the coming months.
Yeah. And my final question is just, understanding both Korea and America, what's one kind of thing that you wish America would kind of take away as a response to coronavirus here, or just in general?
I think the contact tracing, I think, is going to be, really dependent on what people are willing to accept from the government, what's the legacy of the role government has with the population. But, when I talk to my friends and relatives in the US, I mean, it still seems very difficult to get a test unless you're showing symptoms. And if you just think about the life cycle of the way the coronavirus can affect someone, if you catch it late, and then you have to wait to get your test results, by the time you're entering a medical facility or a hospital, you might be in quite bad shape. I think as testing supplies and just testing availability really ramps up, I think the public health strategies could shift. If you know that there's not this scarcity of tests, you can test people earlier and perhaps find it before, maybe while they're asymptomatic, or perhaps when the symptoms are quite mild. I think the studies we've seen here, about 80% of cases were mild or asymptomatic. And again, that's because they're like proactively testing everyone who had been in the vicinity where there was an infection. So, again, Korea is a much smaller country than the US. They had the first mover advantage, if you will, in that they were early hit. So that meant that they had better access to supplies, for the tests. But yeah, I would hope the US could get to that point. Again, as the infections start to slow, and maybe there isn't this constraint on supplies, so people could just find out earlier and perhaps have a better shot at surviving it.
Yeah, I hope so too. Timmy, thanks so much for your time. Just to wrap up, thank you, Thomas, Peter, and Esther in the Korea Society for putting on this great discussion. Thank you, viewers, for watching. I'm Frank with Asian American Journalists Association, and thanks to the Korea Society. Have a good night.